For Leo, the school floor was a vibrating sheet of metal under the sun. Each step on tiptoe was an attempt to minimize contact, to float above the aggression. His arms, slightly open, were not a gesture of strangeness, but the wings of a tightrope walker trying not to fall into the abyss of sensory chaos. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights on the ceiling pierced his eardrums. The colors of the backpacks bled into each other, and the voices were like fine, sharp hailstones. His gait was his. Language, the physical translation of a mind screaming for silence and order. A desperate dance not to drown in the noise of the world. A dance that no one, absolutely no one, understood. Isabel folded Leo's clothes, and the smell of fabric softener was the only soft thing in her day. Later, with Mark already asleep beside her, the silence of the room became a stage for her fears. She talked to the ceiling, the only confidant that offered no solutions. Today was my neighbor's nephew's birthday, she whispered, her voice a whisper. I confirmed we would attend. I bought the gift, dressed him in his best outfit, that cotton shirt he tolerates, and we went. It lasted exactly 12 minutes. 12. The music, the balloons popping, the children running. I saw his eyes widen. I saw his little hands covering his ears. He ran under the dessert table and stayed there, cowering. And the other mothers? They're not bad, Mark. They just don't understand. They looked at me with those poor thing looks, offering me a piece of cake as if that would fix his brain architecture. One of them said to me, "Have you tried lavender oil? It's so calming." I smiled. I thanked her. I picked up my son from under the table, apologized for his bad behavior, and left. As I drove, he didn't cry. He just made that low sound, the sound he makes when the world breaks inside him. And I cried for both of us. I feel like a terrible ambassador for him. I should explain, educate, be patient. But I'm so tired. Tired of being the translator of a language that I'm not even fluent in myself. I remember the first time I took him to the dojo. I was skeptical. It was just another attempt. But the sensei, that wrinkled old man, didn't look at Leo like he was a problem. He knelt down, got down to his level, and said something I'll never forget. Here, we don't fix things. Here, we build. He saw what no one else saw. There was nothing broken there. There was just a different foundation, waiting for the right tools. But the dojo has walls, and the world outside doesn't. Every day I send him off to war without armor, hoping he'll remember how to build his own, while I stay here, piecing mine back together. The journey through false hopes was long and left deep scars on the family's soul. Mark, more pragmatic, kept the receipts as a record of failures. There was equine sensory integration therapy, which promised that the rocking motion of the horse would reorganize Leo's nervous system. The result was a boy terrified by the strong smell of the animals and the imposing size of the horse, who refused to come within 10 meters of the stable. 3 months of advance payments were lost. Then, seduced by an online article, they plunged into a total exclusion diet, eliminating gluten, lactose, sugar, food coloring, and the joy of any meal. Isabel's kitchen became a laboratory of pale, tasteless foods. Leo became thinner, more irritable, but his autism remained untouched, like a mountain indifferent to the wind. Worst of all, however, was Dr. Alain, a psychologist with a French accent and published books, who advocated confrontational immersion. The theory was that overprotective parents were the real problem. In one session, he placed Leo in a room with 3 other noisy children and flashing, beeping toys, and instructed Mark and Isabel to watch through a one-way mirror. He needs to find his own resources, the doctor said, with unnerving calm. They watched for 15 minutes that lasted a lifetime as their son disintegrated. He curled up in the corner, banging his head rhythmically against the wall, a hollow, desperate sound. Isabel stormed into the room, putting an end to it. Dr. Alain had the audacity to say that her reaction was proof of his theory. That night, Mark burned the doctor's books on the barbecue. The smell of burning paper and glue was the smell of a door closing forever. They would not look for anyone else to fix their son. Hope was no longer out there. If it existed, it would have to be found within them in the rubble that those attempts had left behind. Mark had a terrible day at work. He lost an important client and was reprimanded by his boss. He drove to school with the bitter taste of failure in his mouth, a feeling he hated. He parked across the street, wanting only to pick up Leo and sink into the silence of his home. And then he saw the scene unfold, like a macabre play. Julian, a boy who seemed too big for his age, led the siege. Leo was pressed against the school fence. Mark rolled down the window, and the cruel voices reached him, clear and sharp. "Hey, robot, is your battery running low?" shouted one of the boys. Julian approached and mimicked Leo's walk in a caricatured way, exaggerating the swing of his arms and his steps on tiptoes. The laughter of the others was a high-pitched sound of pure mockery. And Leo just cowered, his face turned toward the fence as if trying to pass through it. Mark's impulse was immediate and violent. Get out of the car, cross the street, and end this. His hand was already on the door handle, but he stopped. A wave of ice ran up his spine, and it wasn't fear for the boys. It was a deep, corrosive shame. He imagined the scene. The angry father, the other parents watching, the principal being called, his son, the problem child, with the problem father. In that moment, he didn't see himself as a protector, but as the father of a different child. And the darkest part of himself, the part that longed for a normal, uncomplicated life, chained him to the car seat. He hated Julian, but for a fleeting second, he hated that situation even more, that difference that made his son a target. He stood there, paralyzed by his own weakness, a cowardly spectator to his own son's humiliation. The light turned green. The boys dispersed, and Mark watched Leo walk away, a lonely speck carrying a backpack that looked too heavy. Mark started the car, the engine sounding like an indictment. He was part of the problem. The school hallway was emptying, casting long shadows on the polished floor. The smell of disinfectant and loneliness hung in the air. Leo put his books away in his locker, a slow and methodical ritual. That's when he felt the presence behind him. Julian didn't need his gang to feel powerful. "Lost your voice, weirdo?" he said, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. He pushed Leo, who lost his balance and hit, his back against the row of metal lockers. The sound was loud. Leo turned around, not out of anger, but with the alarm of someone whose personal space had been invaded. The fear on Leo's face fueled Julian's cruelty. "What are you going to do, huh? Cry to your mommy?" He raised his hand, palm open, aiming at Leo's face. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to humiliate. Julian's hand cut through the air. Time for Leo became distorted. The panic that would normally flood his brain was suddenly channeled, like a flood diverted by a dike. Years of training in the dojo, of repetition until the movement became part of his nervous system, came to the surface. He didn't think. He reacted. In a blur of movement, his left arm shot up. It wasn't a punch. It was a defense, a shudo-yuke, a knife block. The side of Leo's hand, hard as wood, intercepted Julian's wrist midway. The sound was not skin against skin, but a dull, dense talk, the sound of force meeting an insurmountable limit. Julian's arm stopped instantly, the kinetic energy of the slap dissipating in a shockwave that made him take a step back, his face contorted with surprise and pain. He looked at his own wrist, now red, and then at Leo. The broken boy stood still, perfectly balanced, his eyes focused, his breathing calm. There was no triumph on his face, no anger. There was only a deep, frightening silence, a silence that said, "This is my space, and you're not coming in." Leo simply lowered his arm, turned away, closed his locker and walked away, leaving Julian alone in the hallway, rubbing his wrist, the echo of that perfect block resonating in his mind like the discovery of a power he never imagined existed. Leo's victory did not echo in screams, but in silence. Julian never bothered him again. The change was sealed a week later in science class. The teacher paired them up to build a simple electrical circuit. The panic in Julian's eyes was visible. He sat down next to Leo, stiff, not knowing how to act. Leo, for his part, ignored him completely. He picked up the wires, the small light bulb, and the battery, and with his engineer's precision, began to assemble the circuit. His hands were steady, his movements economical. Julian just watched, speechless. When Leo finished, the light bulb lit up. He didn't look at Julian for approval. He just looked at the light, satisfied with the order he had created. Julian, awkwardly, pushed the spreadsheet toward him so Leo could fill in his part. Leo picked up the pen and wrote his name in impeccable handwriting. That silence, that competent indifference, was more impactful to Julian than any confrontation. He was not an enemy to Leo. He was not even relevant. The biggest victory, however, was won at home. Mark, haunted by guilt, sat down on the floor of Leo's room. "Son," he began, swallowing his pride. "I'm sorry. Not for you. For me. For being a coward." Leo continued lining up his dinosaur toys. Mark didn't expect an answer. "I want to understand," he said, his voice breaking. "Teach me. Teach me how to be strong like you." He held out his hand, palm up, a gesture of surrender. Leo stopped what he was doing. He looked at his father's hand, then at his face. Slowly, he approached him. He picked up one of his dinosaurs, a small stegosaurus, and placed it gently in Mark's palm. It was a gift, an acceptance, a first step. That night, Isabel found them in the backyard, under the dim light of the porch, Mark trying to imitate a karate stance and Leo patiently adjusting the position of his feet. They were victories without witnesses, but they were the only ones that mattered. Mark felt every muscle in his body protest. At 42, he was the oldest and clumsiest student in the beginner's karate class. The white kimono looked like a costume and his sweat soaked the collar. As he tried for the 10th time to throw a straight punch without losing his balance, he felt pathetic. His frustration was palpable. It was the same frustration he felt when trying to help Leo with his homework. The same impatience he felt when a sensory crisis occurred in public. He looked across the dojo to where Leo's more advanced class was training, and he saw his son. Leo moved like water. Every movement, every breath was a union of purpose and control. There was no hesitation. There was no doubt. While Mark struggled with his own body, Leo was one with his, and the epiphany hit him with the force of the punch he couldn't land. He, Mark, the normal and functional adult, was at war with himself. His body was just a vehicle to carry his brain and his worries. For Leo, the body was a temple, an instrument he tuned and calibrated every second of every day. That walking on tiptoes was an exercise in constant balance. The refusal to eat certain textures was an act of bodily self-awareness. His need for silence was a search for inner harmony. Mark had spent years seeing autism as a set of deficits. Now, kneeling on the mat, feeling the pain in his knees, he saw the truth. He was the one with the deficit, deficient in focus, in discipline, in self-awareness. He wanted to fix his son so he could better navigate his noisy, chaotic world, but Leo already had his own world, a world of order, precision, and a quiet strength that Mark could barely begin to understand. He bowed his head, and the tears that fell on the mat were not tears of frustration, but of humility. The project to fix wasn't his son. It was himself. The calendar turned. The seasons changed, but the new family structure remained. The change was visible in the little things. One Saturday morning, the noise of the television and washing machine running at the same time began to alter the atmosphere in the room. Leo, who was putting together a puzzle on the floor, began to sway, an early sign of overload. In the past, Isabel would have rushed to turn everything off, creating a silent alarm. Mark would have tensed up, waiting for the explosion. This time it was different. Mark got up from the couch, went to the center of the room, and silently began performing the first kata he was learning. His movements were clumsy, still uncertain, but they were intentional. Leo stopped swaying. He watched his father for a moment. Then he stood up and began performing the same kata alongside him, his fluid, precise movements mirroring and guiding his father's. Isabel watched the scene from the kitchen. Two warriors, a master, and an high apprentice, dancing silently in the middle of the living room, pushing chaos away with their shared discipline. Hope, she realized, was not the absence of difficulties. Hope was the presence of tools. They had no map for Leo's future, for the challenges of adolescence or adulthood. The fear of uncertainty still visited her on sleepless nights. But now fear no longer found despair. It found the image of her husband and son, breathing together, finding balance in the midst of the storm. Later, in Chihuahua, the park, Leo walked a little ahead, on tiptoe, his arms slightly open. The same walk as always. But for Mark and Isabel, the image had been rewritten. They no longer saw a fragile boy. They saw a tightrope walker, a master of his own center, walking with silent strength on ground that he, through his own struggle, had learned to make solid. The world is quick to judge the crack on the surface, without ever bothering to understand the strength that the structure contains within. If this story, resonated with you. If it made you feel or think, leave your comment, like, and subscribe. The echo of your empathy may be exactly what someone fighting in their own silence needs to hear today to keep going.